Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris Fritzenray. Mm-hmm. He's a esteemed gentleman, Mr.
Which
Fritzenray.
one?
Boris Fritzenray.
Fritzenray, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Famous CIA operative Boris Fritzenray.
Yes, Agent Boris Fritzenray.
Who was, in 1948, hanging out with Ustashas in Germany and...
Yes.
Going clubbing with Nazi war criminals.
Yeah.
Some of these people are like that. I think in the next few episodes especially, this is like, the highlight reel of the CIA in the post-war period.
Nice.
I mean, you can't make up some of these characters. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah. Especially insane when none of us, for the first time ever, none of us are home. We are all recording this from various locations that are not our usual ones, and it's summer.
Not our usual ones, but sometimes rather unusual ones.
Yeah, particularly unusual ones. Yeah,
true.
So I guess forgive us if the audio quality is kind of all over the place this time.
Or if it's better.
Or if it's better, then, maybe we should just stay where we are.
Don't get used to it. So, all right. Well, summer continues. We watched a few films. Matt Svedek's story was the last Patreon episode we put out. And if you're not a patron, that one, there were some huge revelations in that one, I would say, that I don't want to spoil, but it has something to do with the electroshock dreams of an alcoholic. But apart from that...
Well, all of our Patreon episodes are essential, no?
Yes, and essentially like the electroshock dreams of an alcoholic. Yes.
I think Svedek will come up again in this episode for sure.
I'm not surprised at all. He seems like the kind of guy that like will hang on this arc like a tick,
Oh yeah, totally. Although I'm hoping this is maybe the last we're going to see of him for a while.
How many times have we said that about people?
Yeah, I know, but he literally kills himself with alcohol and goes insane. So, there's...
How many times have we said that about people?
There's only so far we can go with him because, his timeline ends, unnaturally early.
Yeah, yes. But his short and terrible life does help us lead into the really the darker parts of the McCarthy period, which I guess we're looking at today, right?
Yeah, this is kind of how I'd like to round out this, let's say, chapter of the arc that we've done so far, which has been like, pre-World War II, World War II, South Slavs in the U.S., how they, were mostly leftist, labor unionists, broadly speaking, and whatever. And now I think we're going to go into... The way I like to think of it is new beginnings.
Aw. Well, that sounds promising.
For the South Slavic immigrant community. And what I mean by that is the period following World War II and on. We've touched on some of this a bunch, especially in some of the Patreon episodes. But today I want to talk about how the ways in which the American state radically changed the landscape and nature of these communities through direct political repression, heavy-handed covert intelligence, some crazy shit.
Yeah, as we do.
With this stuff, when we're talking about some of these things that are happening in the U.S. at the time, of course, it goes way beyond the scope of just South Slavic communities. Mm-hmm. But the South Slavic examples are some of the more kind of emblematic and extreme ones.
Interesting.
And especially when it comes to this kind of deliberate weaponization of immigrant communities. Very similar things, and sometimes even more extreme, exist with other communities such as Ukrainians, Latvians, Russians in the U.S. Later on, this kind of sets the blueprint for how, for example, the Cuban emigre community is treated with the intelligence community and various others as time goes on. This kind of policy of bringing in and supporting like anti-communist emigre movements and communities, no matter how extreme they are.
Yeah.
And they go through various different loopholes in order to make that happen. It's very interesting. Some of it, I think, is even beyond the scope of this episode. I think we're going to have to talk even more in detail, probably in a whole separate episode, just about the CIA's operations with like ex-Nazis from Eastern Europe.
Of
And
course, yeah.
those things factor really heavily into this. And so, like, I think for the purposes of this episode, we're going to touch up on that a little bit, and then I promise we'll get back to it, because you can talk for hours about this kind of stuff. I know I always say that, but it is absolutely true. Because this shit's really grim and deranged. And, like, as soon as you start seeing this, it kind of activates the little, like, the CIA is behind it all voice that is in all of our heads, you know, that sometimes makes you feel insane. And then you see what kind of fucking shit they were actually doing.
Whose voice is it in your head? Because in mine, it's Art Bell's.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a mixture of Art Bell and what I imagine like one of these like CIA, like a James Jesus Angleton,
Sure.
like a guy that talks like one of those Hollywood movies, like chain smoking, and
that guy is telling you why this was necessary. Oh.
Yeah. Why it was absolutely a good idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fucking nuts. It really is.
What's the time frame we're working with today in this episode?
Today, mostly I'd say 46 to like 53, 55.
Okay. All right.
So again, a kind of time period that we have talked about a little bit, like when we talked about the American Slav Congress, and HUAC. We're kind of revisiting some of that stuff, and
also Svedik,
which is again, like 49, 50, 51, before he completely drops off. You know, as we mentioned, like Matt Svedik was the guy that we talked about in our last Patreon episode, whose story became, a big Hollywood movie called "I Was a Communist for the FBI."
Yep.
Who was a snitch, a Slovenian-American snitch inside the Communist Party, working for the FBI, who created a very elaborate narrative for himself in this whole story, but is actually like a complete fuckhead.
Yeah. I had some trouble writing the episode description for that one because, like, you notice that the word Slovenian's not in it because I couldn't figure out how to write the word Slovenian in there without the wording making it sound like all Slovenians are snitches, or on the other side, all Slovenians are alcoholics. So, and I thought, like, Ray wouldn't have a problem with either, so I just kept it out.
Ray is known for his strong anti-Slovenian bias.
Yes.
Not true, actually.
It's not true.
No, just the yodeling ones, and they got a pass recently. They've been given the pass, the Balkan pass.
For wanting to have liquor.
Yes.
On site at all times.
Exactly.
So maybe the alcoholic thing is kind of true.
It's probably fine.
We don't have the policy of demonizing entire ethnic groups in this show, hopefully.
Not for more than like one episode.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean,
with the demonization of...
No, with like,
No, I heard you.
A nationality's propensity towards drinking. It is like a real thing.
No, the opposite's the weird one. The one where you show up and like at a dry rodeo,
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, Boris. So kick us off here.
So, I mean, I guess...
The scene opens.
The scene opens. I think for like many people who follow U.S. history, McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare aren't particularly obscure chapters. I mean, people know about it. They know about it kind of generally. I think that, what I found from reading some of these kind of on-the-ground reports of what was happening really led me to believe that most of what's discussed kind of on a mainstream level is, it is largely focused on some of the bigger name celebrities, of course, that found themselves in front of HUAC hearings, the Hollywood 10, of course, the Hollywood blacklists and so on and so on. Like, a lot of people know about that. A lot of people know that there was, an anti-communist hysteria. I don't think it's, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it's really common knowledge how that played out on the ground level, what that looked like in terms of some of the kind of extrajudicial formations that existed, not officially linked with the state, sometimes kind of with this murky kind of middle ground of like anti-communist vigilantism that was going on during the time. And that kind of stuff plays really heavily into the destruction of some of these big South Slavic networks that existed that we talked about in the last few episodes. I mean, even when we talk about like Hollywood representation, I think it's interesting that like some of the better known films, whether from the time period like I Was a Communist for the FBI, which was a huge hit in the 50s when it came out, right? We mentioned it was nominated for an Academy Award as Best Documentary, which is insane. It's not a documentary at all. It's a propaganda film.
Yes.
Like
it's the opposite of the documentary. I mean,
right. Yeah. And even like some of the later very well-known films like George Clooney's Good Night and Good Luck, which I think was nominated for like 6 Academy Awards, big A-list cast, blah, blah, blah. Both of those stories involve South Slavic Americans without actually really talking about why they are featured. Yeah. You know what I mean? So like Matt Svedek, they're like, yeah, a lot of Slovenians here in this city. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But, you never really get the idea of, why it was so important to put a Slovenian in that position.
Right.
Or in the case of George Clooney's film, like, which, one is celebrates Huac and the other one is kind of like the good journalists who took down McCarthy. I mean, neither of them really talk extensively about why these particular people were being investigated or why people of this particular ethnic group were being put as snitches for the FBI. And I think that's really interesting because, I mean, those are really, really mainstream, but, kind of completely overlooks that. And I think there's a good reason for that because it got pretty ugly, I got to say. Because this government repression of like the South Slavic radicalism, it's not the kind of thing that, the U.S. government would be particularly happy to talk about now. Or
it's one of them, their dark chapters.
Oh, yeah. I mean, with some of this that we're going to talk about here in a sec, like, I mean, in certain smaller cities and communities, you had people, by some accounts, who were involved in like, local government and stuff like that, directly helping like vigilante squads, like beating people in their apartments and stuff like that. Really crazy shit. Right. So just a quick recap. I mean, we talked quite a bit about how the successes of some of these big organizations like the American Slavic Congress and the United Committee during World War II ended up kind of becoming a major thorn in the side of the government, right? We mentioned this in a bunch of episodes. I mean, people who were either linked or suspected to be linked to any of these kinds of groups were called up to testify at HUAC proceedings, questioned extensively to really, even to like really small local groups and stuff, like their affiliation with this was highly questioned.
HUAC that we mention all the time is actually, what's the full name?
Oh, the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. We just got used to calling it HUAC and HUAC, but yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
The successor to the DIES Committee.
Right.
From Texas. You're welcome.
But in many cases, we haven't talked about like what the implications of that were. So like people who would be called up if they refused to testify would be held in contempt of court. People who were even named but weren't really affiliated with anything in particular were fired from their jobs and blacklisted and had difficulty finding other employment. And we'll get into some like kind of more specific cases here in a minute. But it can definitely be said that there was a deliberate attention was being given to breaking apart all these nationality organizations, and formations such as like Americans Battling Communism, ABC, which was kind of an interesting group based in Western Pennsylvania. People like Steve Nelson and others talk about it a lot. It was a group that arose as like a kind of broad anti-communist network that came about as a result of paranoia that the Croatian fraternal union was infiltrated by Reds. What's interesting about it is that it doesn't necessarily come from the Croatian community itself. A lot of the people, the founders of it, some of them were like lawyers in Pittsburgh, people affiliated with like certain judges, and then kind of a lot of just random like, you know, vigilantes. So like Catholic groups in particular were kind of interested in this and the like. And their primary occupation was to kind of work hand in hand with the state. So they would, you know, name lists of known communists or whatever to local tabloid papers, publish their addresses and like maybe some sensational aspects of, you know, what they were doing, their activities and the like. And then this would kind of get investigated by local authorities or, you know, employers or something like that. So, so this could lead, for example, there are many cases of people who would be named by the ABC who would then get investigated by like either local courts or even HUAC or their employers and get, you know, cut off from benefits or fired from their job. One example, there's a case of this guy, Steve Devonich, who was a machinist at some tire factory in Western Pennsylvania, who was 6 months away from receiving his pension, right, from retiring. He was named by ABC and then investigated subsequently by local authorities and his employer as being a Communist Party member. You know, he was relatively old at this point, had been involved with founding the union at his workplace, right? He was a union activist in his workplace. But since legislation had been passed, like the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it illegal for Communist Party members to be active in unions, he was threatened with not receiving his pension, right, unless he were to cease his union activities and carry out the last, you know, whatever, 6 months of his job as a non-union activist or whatever member.
So when these accusations were made, is it specifically that this man is a member of the Communist Party or that this man is just like a sympathizer? Like, do they have to say?
It doesn't particularly matter because, I mean, again, this happens. I mean, this is like doxing. It's the old school like doxing, basically.
Yeah.
But they do it with like, you know, tabloid newspapers, and, you know, these white right-wing groups would, you know, publish a list of names and addresses and be like, these people are either Communist Party members or covert, you know, whatever, operatives. Okay.
You
know, Soviet spies, this, that, and the other thing.
Wouldn't go out with me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Matt Svedek was absolutely that. I mean, except that he actually worked for the FBI directly and snitched on, like, you know, was undercover. But this was, you know, largely people who weren't particularly, could be like anyone, you know, it was a pretty large group, but they could muster pretty large numbers, which is like, you know, kind of shocking. And so the way this played out against these kind of national fraternal organizations that we had talked about so much in previous episodes kind of starts with some of the legal proceedings against the International Workers' Order. And we mentioned them briefly. They were kind of the Communist Party's front fraternal organization. So basically doing what a lot of fraternal organizations traditionally did, which was offer like low-cost insurance to its members, right? And it was kind of this, you know, communist, progressive, whatever, as they called it at the time.
Like a mutual aid society.
Mutual aid society that was led by the party.
Yeah.
They got completely broken apart during the McCarthy era, in that we don't really have time to like talk about that specifically, but it did have kind of ripple effects into these fraternal organizations because they had members, you know, throughout, for example, like the Croatian Fraternal Union. Lots of people were also members of the International Workers' Order and the like. And so the paranoia within these fraternal organizations started to get pretty ramped up, and they were forced to purge membership in their ranks of anybody that was either a member of these different organizations that were being persecuted at the time, for fear that they would lose, for example, liquor licenses or any kind of other state certification that they had. So like, like for example, the Croatian Fraternal Union operated thousands of like halls throughout the United States, right? Their leadership was afraid that, if they have too many commies in their group, they're going to get their entire network shut down, basically. And if you can't operate a liquor license,
yeah, right,
which, are to listeners, outside of the U.S. who might not know, liquor licenses in many states in the U.S. are extremely hard to get and very expensive. And in some states, like they can last forever. Like once you have it, and there's only a certain amount that go around. I mean, it's a major thing to lose. It's not like, oh, okay, we'll just close and open up somewhere else.
Right.
Especially if you're facing direct state repression like these people were.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the FBI was actually directly visiting any hall, and including individuals too. But when it comes to these like fraternal organizations or any of these like networks of social halls or whatever, they would visit any place that was subscribed to certain newspapers. So we talked a lot about the Free Word, the People's Herald, the Serbian and Croatian, like communist newspapers. The FBI would regularly visit, say, any like fraternal hall that had a subscription. As we mentioned before, like, some of those priests, when they had their churches, before they got like, purged by the Serbian Orthodox Church, had like their entire congregation subscribed to these newspapers. I mean, these newspapers had tens of thousands of subscribers throughout the U.S., right? And the FBI did this as a deliberate fear tactic, right? Especially when you're like visiting people's houses. Be like, oh, you subscribe to this, subversive newspaper or whatever. And this would cause major problems for these newspapers. Those ones in particular wouldn't last much longer. They were kind of like some of the bigger victims of the McCarthy period for like, at least the South Slavic community. There are some interesting examples of how this looked on the ground, like what the atmosphere was like. I mean, we mentioned in our Matt Svedek episode that when the film I Was a Communist for the FBI came out in like 1950, that the mayor of Pittsburgh, which is where that guy was from, where it was set, declared that day to be Matt Svedek Day. And that there were, throngs of, he was paraded through the streets to these, anti-communist masses that,
Dude,
filled the halls. And
I'm telling you, this is his dream. You know what I mean? I'm saying every year since 51 has been inside of his head. And that proves it.
They should have like Joshua Saturday in South Carolina.
Yes.
I mean, he probably could. He's from like a small. I mean, he was based in a small town outside of like Charleston or something, right?
Lexington or something.
Lexington, South Carolina. Yeah. I bet you could convince the mayor there to do a.
Sure.
I think he burned some bridges there, though. I think. Not sure he's that popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to be anti-communist in the 1950s, it's 40s. It's another thing to be like a Nazi Satanist in the Deep South.
A lot of parallels, but not the same.
Yeah. But, for example, I read this interesting case from 1949, which kind of describes how this like anti-communist hysteria was playing out. So I believe it was ABC or one of these other similar kind of anti-communist groups in Pittsburgh had published this communist meeting that was happening at a Carnegie library in the city. It had been going on regularly for years, had pretty high attendance, whatever. To them, it was pretty unremarkable because it had been going on for so long. But I guess somebody eventually caught word that a bunch of Reds are using, this public infrastructure, which is, of course, open to anybody to have these meetings, and riled up a gang to go confront them. Mm-hmm. And depending on the account, they're up to like a few hundred anti-communist picketers that showed up to this event at this library that included various different groups like veterans organizations, Catholic organizations, a union, members of a union that Steve Nelson describes as being under right-wing leadership, quote unquote. I don't know.
Steve Nelson, just for the free listeners here, prominent labor organizer and sort of, I guess he had the role of like commissar for the Communist Party in the way that Mirko Markovic had, and like keeping the ideological line Stalinist, but also apart from that was a war hero of the Spanish Civil War. One-time commander of the Lincoln Washington Brigade.
He was a commissar in the Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, okay.
Brigade.
All right.
Yeah.
So that's Steve.
Steve Nelson, also not his real name.
No, his real name is Stepan Meseroš, and he was born in modern-day Croatia, and was involved with this, specifically like some of the Croatian language chapters of the Communist Party. Very interesting biography.
Mm-hmm.
He later kind of renounced Stalinism, but still remained like a left radical in some ways.
Yeah.
So interesting character. Completely demonized in that movie. I was a communist for the FBI. I mean, he's literally a villain.
Yes. Deeply racist Bond villain.
Yeah. But this turned into a full-scale riot.
Uh-huh.
Some newspapers at the time described, chairs and newspaper boxes flying, men and women getting pummeled alike, big fistfights, spilled out into the streets and lasted for almost an hour before, mounted police units came and broke it up. So this gives you kind of a picture of what that looks like on the ground, right? Because we think of like, okay, HUAC committees, this and that. I didn't really think so much of like, anti-communist riots.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And for example, the consequences that this had, like I mentioned for the Free Word and People's Herald, is pretty important. For example, they, from about 1947 on, were subject to kind of constant vigilante attacks. Their windows would get broken at night. The editors and printers would get harassed and sometimes attacked on the street as they were coming and going from the newspaper, which got to the point, it got bad enough that they, this is a building that they owned, that they bought in 35 or whatever, that they ended up just shuttering and moving to Chicago because like the pressure was so high on them, both from the local authorities. Tons of them were getting investigated. I mean, I think we talked about this in the other Patreon episode as well, but, a lot of their editors had moved back to Yugoslavia. The ones that were still there were, subject to continual harassment by the state. And so, they moved to Chicago, and that was kind of the end for them. I mean, they're closed. They ceased to exist by 1951. And some of this has to do with the way that the Yugoslav socialist and leftists kind of in general dealt with the Tito-Stalin split, because it did kind of split within the movement there of people that stayed loyal to Tito and the Communist Party of the USA that stayed loyal to the Stalin line and said that, Tito was a social fascist or whatever. Mm-hmm. But that spelled the end for them. So, the Free Word and the People's Herald that we talked so much about, they're gone by 51. They're like, completely, basically destroyed by McCarthyism and, it's other vigilante incarnations. And it gets pretty extreme, too, with some of the other cases that I read. Again, some of this is from Steve Nelson's autobiography, but there are also other accounts of this as well, in which you had like the FBI regularly surveilling everybody's houses. They all knew that, of course. Steve Nelson himself was under suspicion for sedition. He was convicted to 20 years, I think, in prison, eventually got out after only like a year or so. But, this was he was under surveillance for, being potentially the Communist Party's link to espionage, the whole Rosenberg thing, the atomic, the bomb, and all that. I mean, he writes about it in his autobiography in a kind of funny way, saying that, like, I mean, we're not that stupid. He was like, I was high up in the party, and I have known that I've been under surveillance for, over 10 years. Like, it would be dumb for me to be involved directly with espionage. It doesn't make sense because I was constantly being watched by them. But he brings up some other examples of kind of scary stuff that happened to, like, neighbors of his and other people where anti-communist vigilantes would show up disguised as FBI agents. Perhaps they were FBI agents. It's not clear. And, would barge their way into a house. In some cases, like, tied people up and beat the shit out of them. Then when these people went, to report it to the police and be like, why are you, I got the shit kicked out of me by like somebody who said they were a federal agent. They'd say, oh, we know nothing about this.
Yeah.
Which, these are very typical tactics that most states employ when they're trying to,
right,
do some good old fashioned political repression. In this case, like, I think very few people in America talk about that today, or even know that kind of thing happens, rather extensively.
Yeah.
But, since I already mentioned George Clooney's movie, Good Night and Good Luck, and The Free Word, we kind of have to talk a little bit about the case of what inspired that film, and is credited, I think, not really rightly so, for turning public opinion against McCarthy. And that is this case of this guy, Milo Radulovic, who was a Serbian-American Air Force officer who was named fingered by somebody at some point in, the anti-communist hysteria of the late 1940s, early 50s.
Oof, yeah, man, the term "he got fingered" really changed over the years.
I know, it is a term that you see a lot when you read stuff from that time period, including like Steve Nelson, cross-examining Matt Svedek on the stand, and he's like, you fingered me, didn't you?" And then Svedek objecting to the term fingering, but not because it implies, him like fingering his asshole or something.
Yeah. And then a bunch of tough guys came over and fisted me. They fisted me hard.
Because no, that implies that he was a snitch. It was like, you literally are a snitch.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So Radulovic was fingered.
He really beat me off.
Jesus Christ. Children.
Gave me the reach around.
This is obviously being the title of this episode, yeah.
This
Otherwise, very serious episode, but for sure we'll call it fingering or something like that.
Radulovic got fingered or something.
Yes.
Fingered by the state. Yeah.
I think that was one of those really stupid like goth metal bands had like the "Touched by Jesus, Fingered by God." I can't remember. Anyway, back to serious topics.
So he got fingered. Go on.
So Milo, they do call him Milo. Milo Radulovic was a Serbian-American Air Force officer from Detroit, Michigan, who was named in 1953 as being a communist sympathizer. Basically what happened, to kind of make a long story short, is that his father and sister came up in certain reports about subversive communist activity. His dad was a sympathizer for the American Slav Congress and was a subscriber to the Serbian communist paper, The Free Word. And this is kind of a typical, almost like show trial situation in which this guy was forced to have to denounce his father and sister and, implicate them in communist activities. And he refused to do so and was kicked out of the Air Force. Now, like I said, this kind of thing was not unusual. I mean, this shit happened all the fucking time. I mean, Svedek alone named 300 people in his local area that may or may not have been associated with communists. Tons of them lost their jobs, guys who were, violinists in the symphony and teachers and shit like that, people he didn't like. It doesn't matter. In this case, you can see that it even goes to familial association. So, if you don't denounce your father and sister, bam, you lose your job, career in the Air Force.
Yeah.
What is unusual about this case is that it attracted the attention eventually of CBS's host of the popular program See It Now, Edward R. Murrow, who did a series of episodes about kind of the absurdity of the Radulovic case, right? That this guy was, it's kind of a perfect example, right? He's an officer in the U.S. Air Force, right? Seems to be kind of a loyal patriotic American, whatever, gets stripped of his rank and, fired for not like ratting on his dad for being, a sympathizer to the American Slav Congress and a subscriber to the free word, which only like 5 years before, as we said, were like, their editors were meeting with like the highest levels of the U.S. state, were enjoying, considerable like press attention and freedom and support or whatever. This was, grounds for him, as result of his dad and his sister's potential activity to be, stripped of his position in the Air Force. Now, this definitely did have some effect on, the public's perception of the victims of McCarthyism, right? I mean, because this was pretty absurd. Again, like I said, completely not exceptional when you look at it more broadly. But, like public opinion was on mainstream media. It was a very important case at the time in the 50s when it came out. Now, of course, George Clooney turned that into Good Night and Good Luck, which takes that a little bit farther. It's like, one of these kind of the man who single-handedly took down McCarthy.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, great man.
But nothing to do, of course, with, all the other motherfuckers that lost their jobs because they read the free word or whatever, attended the American Slav Congress meetings with tens of thousands of other people in Detroit. I mean, not great. But I mean, so as you can see there, I mean, from some of these examples that I just gave, these large anti-fascist and or kind of leftist organizations that exist in the South Slavic community kind of felt the brunt of the crackdown pretty hard. I mean, even the De Leonists talk about this in their newspaper, right? Like, membership never recovered from, like, whether it was any of these groups, membership never recovered, right? Because if you're getting visited by the FBI for reading a fucking newspaper, you're much less likely to subscribe to that newspaper again.
Yes.
And that happened in a major way with even like the De Leonists. They talk about this pretty extensively, like, because their membership dropped. They already in the 1940s didn't have huge membership, right? And they were controversial because they were, against involvement in the Second World War, all this other kind of stuff.
They only started the Socialist Labor Party, right?
Yeah, Socialist Labor Party.
Yeah.
But they especially didn't recover after this because, of course, people were afraid to join their mailing lists, or afraid to subscribe to their newspaper. Although they did continue much longer than some of these other Communist Party affiliated groups, largely because they didn't have to deal with the Tito-Stalin split or the internal politics of the Communist Party of America, which went through all kinds of crazy shit, especially in the 50s and 60s. But I mean, this was something that they couldn't recover from and that they weren't going to recover from because what happened next made it a lot harder to do anything in kind of ethnic communities of South Slavs. And what I mean by that is the immigration of tens of thousands of anti-communist. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Let's be generous and not call them all Nazis or fascist collaborators, even though very many of them were. But this was also a deliberate effort. And, I can't help but think that, especially in this particular case of the South Slav immigrants that, the U.S. government didn't like very much anymore, they could definitely see the utility in bringing in a lot of other guys to kind of balance it out. You know what I mean?
To have their you get that image of it's the model minority image in some ways, but taken to a sort of extreme in this way. Like the model minority is not just one that works hard, but is also one that is anti-communist and therefore like shows their loyalty to the U.S. Yeah, right.
I mean, one thing that like I haven't mentioned is that like by and large, like okay, so the decline of these kind of more anti-fascist, let's say, elements in the South Slavic emigre communities it was aided in large part by, state repression, dismantling the infrastructure and the pretty vast infrastructure that they had throughout the country. But then also the assimilation that happened with most immigrant groups, white European immigrant groups in particular, in the U.S., especially in the 1950s, right? Which, has been covered a lot in, mainstream media. Like, why did, suburbanization, kind of the vast economic growth in the 1950s and 60s, a decline in, radical labor being a thing, as opposed to, kind of just mainstream labor unions, comfortable middle class life and the like. That's another part of it. But absolutely, it would be rather different if some of those networks still existed. And the Croatian Fraternal Union is kind of an interesting exception to this, in that they had to purge their members, but they were kind of the only one of the large fraternal organizations that eventually, in the 1950s, had a chairman who lasted quite a long time, who was very pro-Yugoslav and didn't take this kind of Croatian nationalist line. And this would be a major problem in the 60s with all these Ustašas that are coming over right now.
Right.
So would it be wrong to is this replacement? Did they get replaced? Is this what the Nazis always talk about?
This is the great replacement of what
the
socialists
Ustašas have replaced them.
Yeah.
Except they were the replacers here, right?
Yes, yes. So the replaced are the the non-Nazi Croatian immigrant community.
Yes. Yes. There you go.
No, like I for many years I'd always thought that it was like my paranoid brain that was like, this had to have been a deliberate thing. That they like brought in that many of these guys. Like, how the fuck did Andrija Artuković, who's the Minister of the Interior of the Ustaša state, like responsible for killing like hundreds of thousands of people, just like end up living in like California, like it's like a major war criminal, major war criminal, like living in California, starting a life with like a new family, living the American dream, California dream out there in like LA or whatever.
Amazing.
Like how the fuck did that didn't happen accidentally?
No.
Because like when you read some like official narratives about that, it's like, well, he came in under an assumed name. They didn't really know who he was until, the Yugoslav government finally in the 1980s managed to get him extradited. I mean, he's one of the very few that ended up getting extradited and tried in Yugoslavia, because most people that made it to the U.S., stayed there unless they got assassinated by the Yugoslav secret police. But like that was like the only one of the like high level criminals that was ever extradited back. And until like I started reading some of the declassified documents and some of the books that are about like the American Nazi rat lines, which again most people know of Operation Paperclip. They know about Werner von Braun and the German Nazi scientists in America and all of them that were brought to the U.S. What's interesting is some of the other operations there, which are not Paperclip, like Bloodstone, for example.
Operation Bloodstone.
Operation Bloodstone, which was the CIA's covert program to recruit and train Nazi collaborationists in Europe after World War II to do stuff like stay behind units, organize, anti-communist political organizations and guerrilla organizations and the like.
In Europe at first?
In Europe. But this went then to the US. And the connections here, I mean, we'll do a whole separate series of episodes, I think, on some of the details about this, because what's interesting is that, like, people know that a lot of people know kind of generally that the Catholic Church was involved with the rat lines of Nazis to, like, say, Argentina or to the United States later. What's interesting about that is that they were almost all Croatian Catholic, like high-ranking members of the Croatian Catholic Church, many of whom were, outright Ustašas.
Who organized this, right?
Who organized this, yeah. And particularly this guy, Monsignor Krunoslav Draganović, who is a very interesting figure. We'll talk a lot about him, I think, later. But for the purposes of this episode, it's important to know that he was 100% a CIA asset. I mean, that's not denied by anybody. He was one of the main figures behind Operation Bloodstone's activity in Europe. He had the contacts for basically every single Nazi in Europe. He was involved with sheltering many collaborationists at different Catholic monasteries around Europe, particularly in Italy. And this is literally everyone. I mean, we're talking everybody from Latvians and Ukrainians to Chetniks, to Klaus Barbie, who's probably the most high profile, the Butcher of Lyon, who was probably the most high profile Nazi that he was directly linked with, taking to Argentina, later Bolivia.
So the guy who was helping Klaus Barbie get out and who was in Ustasha was also helping Chetniks.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the beautiful part about this arc.
Yeah.
It's fantastic because it doesn't look good for any of them. It doesn't look good for the Ustashas that they're helping out Chetniks. It doesn't look good for the Chetniks that they're, seeking shelter in Franciscan monasteries in Italy.
Right. Yeah.
And having their way paid to the US through Ustashas who are in contact with the CIA.
Yeah, and of course, this is not the first time they collaborated. I think, as we mentioned in some of the episodes of our Arc 2, during the war, there was collaboration between Chetniks and Ustashas, and some of the Chetnik formations that operated on the territory of the independent state of Croatia were kind of legalized by the independent state of Croatia and tolerated there.
Yes. But for the purposes of this episode, since we'll dedicate a lot more time to the rat lines, specifically and to some more of the CIA operations, what's interesting to me and what's important for this narrative of how, the Yugoslav South Slavic emigre community in the US became dominated by pretty extreme right figures, and Chetniks and Ustashas and the like, was that the CIA basically, their policy was at this time was to get anyone who is anti-communist, right? Mm-hmm. In the US, they already had the network in the Serbian community of the Serbian National Federation, the American Serbian Defender, and the Serbian National Defense, which were already very pro-Chetnik, right? And pro-US government, right? They were extremely anti-communist. This, to US intelligence, was great. This is exactly the model that they wanted to replicate throughout these different ethnic communities, which is what you need in the US are emigre communities that are anti-communist, that can agitate, that can do a lot of things without our involvement, direct involvement, but that are beneficial to national security into broader policy objectives. So in this really great book by Christopher Simpson, he talks about he quotes some CIA officials when they're talking about what their policy should be for developing these kind of anti-communist movements more broadly, which is kind of a plausible deniability from the U.S. government's perspective, right? Mm-hmm. On the official U.S. government policy isn't to meddle in the internal affairs of the Soviet Union or any of its satellite states, right? It has diplomatic relations, it does this and that. They are at odds with each other, but the official government policy isn't, we want to break apart the Soviet Union. They can't say that directly.
Yeah.
So what they do, and I think it's this guy, Keenan, had a quote that I thought was pretty great. He said, there are a number of interesting and powerful political groupings among Russian exiles, any one of which would probably be preferable to the Soviet government from our standpoint as rulers of Russia, right? And this is extended to all of communist Europe, right? And later, they do this similar things in Asia as well. But I mean, this is in 1949, 1950, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea isn't, necessarily, it moved from we're going to start anti-communist guerrillas and move them into these places and try to take down the state that way. That didn't work. There were attempts, for example, in Albania to do that with anti-communists. All of them went to the U.S. Actually, some others to like South Africa and Rhodesia and stuff. But
okay,
that's a different story. We'll talk about that chapter of Albanian fascism at some point. I think we have to. But like it moved a lot away from that and more towards facilitating emigre communities who it doesn't matter how extreme they are, as long as they're anti-communist, we don't care.
uh-huh.
I mean, it's probably even better if they're more extreme, which means they're more motivated on their own to do anti-communist stuff.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And they're pretty explicit about that in their memos to each other at the time.
Yeah.
But the point is to maintain this official facade of, that's not us, right?
Yeah.
That's a U.S. government policy isn't to, break apart the Soviet Union. It's not to, bring back, the OUN to Ukraine or, establish an Ustasha state.
Yeah.
But as long as they are valuable, that's important to us. That's kind of the official standpoint. Unofficially, or, confidentially, they're like, absolutely, this is awesome. These guys, they're really hardcore. They're well trained. All of the Allied kind of powers had a kind of fetishization, I think, and like admiration for the Waffen-SS.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty clear. Even like if you watch like the History Channel and like this kind of like the SS, they were really like smart and immortal and like all this other stuff.
Elite,
elite. Interestingly, of course, when the Tito-Stalin split happens, the Titoists start revealing how much the NKVD and the Soviets were also using former SS members for intelligence. That's when they publicly accuse the Soviet Union of working with Ustashas to try to set up a Ustasha Soviet Republic. Anyway, that's kind of a different story.
Well, that should be an episode, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll get there because I'm reading some shit now from Max Loburic's communication from Spain in the 1960s, which has some pretty interesting stuff in it. But yeah, that's a different story. In terms of the CIA, though, they were able to bring large numbers of people who would otherwise be kind of earmarked as being fascist collaborators or something through a series of national security directives. And specifically, the ones that applied particularly to bringing over all these fascist collaborators were NSCID number 13 and 14, which is the National Security Council Intelligence Directive number 13 and 14. These were confidential until, I don't know, the 90s or something.
Okay.
The Freedom of Information Act, there was the whole, when they opened all the documents about like Nazi war criminals and the like, is when you actually see some of this come out, right? And so these are directives from 1950 and based upon some other previous directives from the late 40s, which I would like to read maybe part of it because it's interesting legal language. So directive number 13.1, it is in accord with the best U.S. tradition to endeavor to protect and assist those fleeing from persecution. Under present conditions, and with due regard for the effects of such action on diplomatic and political interests of the United States, it is also the important interest of national security that defectors be welcomed and assisted in obtaining a degree of personal and economic security and made to feel that there's a place for them in a free society. The best sources of information and intelligence on the Soviet world, necessary in the interests of national security, are defectors from Soviet control. The most effective agents to destroy the communist myth of Soviet paradise are defectors who are able to tell the truth about the conditions of life behind the Iron Curtain. 2. The term defectors here is employed to denote individuals who escape from the control of the USSR or countries in the Soviet orbit, or who, being outside such jurisdiction or control, are unwilling to return to it, and who are of special interest to the US government. A, because they are able to add valuable, new, or confirmatory information to existing US knowledge of the Soviet world. B, because they are of operational value to a US agency. Or C, because their defection can be exploited in the psychological field.
Oh.
Yeah, it's pretty overt there.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to to go on to describe different categories of defectors to the point that it means basically anyone leaving the Soviet Union. And the CIA used this and the other directive, number 14, to be able to bring in a lot of people bypassing like the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Services.
Sure.
Right. So they let, at first, I think, the CIA was like, we need to bring in this like 12,000 people right now. Congress is like, well, let's make it 500. Okay, let's make it 500. Next year, 12,000, and so on.
Okay.
So on. And these are, in many cases, like high-ranking SS, Latvian SS people, Ukrainian SS people.
Man.
Vlasov's Free Russian Army or whatever that we talked about actually back in the episode that we did about the little split off Orthodox churches.
Yeah.
I mentioned that like the Russian Nazi collaborators have like a monument in like upstate New York.
Yes.
It's because like the CIA brought all of their high ranking guys over to the US and they were able to just, set up living. They were given financial resources. They should be given resources to enjoy life in a free society. What does that mean is that like a lot of these people had
UBI
underwriting from like the CIA, right?
Uh-huh.
One would also think that like, okay, the CIA was established after World War II to deal with things outside of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most people know that like the FBI is kind of it's the federal police as much as that exists in the US. They deal with things broadly internally in the US. The CIA deals with affairs abroad.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the NSA and everything else. But what's interesting about the CIA's activities with these emigre communities in particular is that they were able to exploit some loopholes in these national security directives to work with emigre groups within the United States in the interest of American foreign policy abroad. Mm-hmm. To the point that, like, before I'd even like read about some of those loopholes, I had a suspicion that something like that was true, because anytime I would look up in the Freedom of Information Act, like declassified documents of the CIA's about like, certain, let's say like Chetnik emigres, I would get a lot of CIA material about it, not nearly as much FBI material. And that's because these people did, in large part, report directly to the CIA.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
The FBI also worked with them. We can get more into some of those dynamics like later on in future episodes when we cover this in more detail. But it is pretty interesting that the way that they were able to exploit that, right? Because that's...
So they were able to build their own networks domestically through this. Their own tunnels, essentially, to act.
Yes.
Very interesting. Do you think when the CIA was going before Congress and saying, like, we need 12,000 people, and Congress is like, we'll give you 500, do you think they just outright said, like, come on, guys, that barely covers the Nazis,
Yeah. Well, I mean, they added a specific immigration category for this eventually, which is displaced persons of national interest. Which came to like, cover quite a few different people. But to make the job of getting as many anti-communists into the U.S. as possible.
Sorry. No, I just realized that like that makes like Sutter an internally displaced person of national interest.
Yeah. He's literally an IDP, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. He's IDP NI. Yeah.
There were many CIA initiatives that we know about. For example, like, Radio Free Europe and the like, that were, meant to be, CIA funded projects to push U.S. government interests in the communist world. What's interesting, though, is that in order to because in the early days, they were only able to get so many people over that were like, SS people and the like. It would be potentially hard to convince certain congressmen that like Andrei Artukovic has like a place is of vital national interest to the United States. Like literal just sadistic butcher, but like
depends on the congressman, I guess.
I imagine it would be more like I mean, how well known was he? Maybe they would just omit, about 10 years of his activities or 5 or something like this.
Yeah, but he's like an OG Ustasha. I mean, he was
true.
when they were still back, when they were illegal in like the 30s. You know what I mean? He wasn't he didn't jump on the bandwagon. He was on from the very beginning. And like I mentioned in a couple other episodes, U.S. government intelligence, like the amount they knew about like all these different groups in Yugoslavia is pretty extensive. Like they kept pretty good records, pretty good tabs. They knew they have a pretty good understanding and still do of like the different political factions. Whoever works their desks there is relatively knowledgeable. That isn't to say that like the conclusions that they come to are, smart or reasonable in any way, but on like a pure informational basis, like, when they're talking about Ustashas, they know who everybody is.
Yeah.
Like, people don't like fall, between the cracks of like the CIA and the OSS's knowledge of these different groups. Right.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they then did covertly within the U.S. to facilitate an even larger number of transfer of people is to fund, again, covertly, different ethnic aid organizations and like, so I don't know, Refugee Council for Latvian Americans or whatever. You can change the nationality. They had one basically for everyone. And this was a way of kind of circumventing the CIA's direct involvement with bringing over Nazi war criminals and allowed these guys to basically cook the books and do whatever they needed to do to bring as many people over as possible. And that's how you end up with, like 13,000 like Waffen SS dudes, like coming in like a single year to the US. All of which, these organizations were registered with the U.S. government, had full authorization to pretty much do whatever they wanted, and were funded by the CIA to do that, exactly that. So bring as many useful people into the U.S. or potentially useful people into the U.S. And it got even like more explicit with certain right-wing ideologues in the U.S. Certain congressmen, once these communities started to be established, certain congressmen were like, well, it is beneficial for us, for example, to bring over more anti-communists who can get citizenship and vote Republican, for example. This is very, very openly talked about by guys like, what's his name, Arthur Bliss Lane, who, traditionally these immigrant communities tended to vote, Democrat, big supporters of the New Deal, whatever. Let's bring over some others who will vote Republican, which is exactly the anxiety that Republicans now have over immigration. It's interesting.
Yeah,
right.
Like, they'll bring over all the, Latin Americans who will vote Dem or whatever.
Right.
They were literally doing that with, like Nazis from like Eastern Europe. Quite explicitly so, with help of the fucking state. It's horrifying.
Bliss Lane was the U.S. minister to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, apparently.
Yeah, and he was the last ambassador to Poland.
I see that. Yeah.
Or he was the ambassador to Poland when the Soviets became a puppet state or whatever.
He was also in Nicaragua when Sandino was murdered.
Oh yeah, no, these people will be everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean that this is all like a very brief introduction to some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in a lot more detail throughout this arc, because most of the people that are going to come up in this arc, like these Ustasha terrorists, these Chetniks who were established in the U.S., and all these various guys were all connected in some way or another to U.S. intelligence and were brought over for explicitly to be anti-communists.
Of course.
And this had a long-lasting effect, again, on these communities that we just spent the first part of this arc talking about, right? It radically changed the dynamics of how these communities operated, what it looked like. I've seen numerous accounts of people, and that even within, like, for example, I don't know, like the Serbian community that had like this like large Chetnik sympathizers, some of them were not nearly as extreme as the people that came over. There's a good account, I believe, of when some of the high-ranking Chetniks came to like Chicago, and they went to one of these like Serbian halls, and they were disgusted that the band started playing Croatian songs.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that's that's because in those communities that was not that kind of separation didn't really exist,
right
because they had spent so long kind of together that these Chetniks, I don't remember whether it was Jujic or like some people in his posse.
Some of the guys who collaborated with Ustashas are now discussed.
Yes. Yes.
Songs. Yeah.
They come to a Serbian hall and they expect, they hear all these nice Serbian songs, and then they're like, wow, they're playing all these Croatian songs. What's wrong with them? You know what I mean? And the same thing is true from various accounts from the Croatian community as well. Like there's a video and some accounts that I read from like the Croatian fraternal unions, like papers and the like, which is like, they're talking to these like old timers in the 80s. Like, our community is really nice. It's really great. We have our picnics and, we do our events and blah, 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 blah. Like, all in all, I can say we get along very well. Except, those people that came after the war, they kind of ruined it for us. Yeah. And, that's how we get to where we are today. I mean, every single one of these groups, like I said, that we're going to talk about for like however long this arc goes, is going to be some scumbag that at some point some dickhead in an office in the CIA ticked a box that was like, yeah, let them come over.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
And then those people a couple of decades later are representing themselves as like these old Serbian or Croatian emigres coming from a long tradition that had to leave Yugoslavia because of repression, and they're, then influencing domestic politics in Yugoslavia to go right-wing in an insane way. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, many of them come back in the 90s and establish themselves, as political figures, or fund various different operations. I mean, you can't put too much blame on these people, but they definitely had played a significant role in keeping various ideologies alive and developing them in ways that like become acceptable, through the CIA playbook. Eventually we'll see, pretty much with all of these groups, like Ustashas will be like, well, okay, shouldn't be directly fascist anymore. Use the word democracy a lot. And they all do. And then, you have nationalist parties that are, democratic.
Yes.
And they're every single one of them, whether they're Serbs, Bosniaks, Croats, all of their fascist emigres become like Democrats.
Yeah.
In some way or another. And, a lot of them spent decades, talking to handlers and stuff. And reporting to FBI and CIA people.
Sure.
And this is the kind of like, galaxy brain, I'm going crazy. Everybody's an intelligence asset. But in this case, it is very much true. It is much more true than many people would like to believe in any of those.
I mean, most factions. Of these people like Chetniks and Ustashas, like in terms of politics, they were kind of pro-genocide. They're not necessarily so fascist. Like they became more fascist when they were aligned with fascists. And then, when they were aligned with Democrats, they could, switch their ideology as long as they remained very, nationalistic and chauvinist. I think that's the basis of their ideology, I think.
And I think that's a message we're going to continually drive home throughout this arc. Yeah.
So next time somebody says that Yugoslavia broke up because of the CIA, you can now say, kinda? What?
Well, yeah, but a lot of the people that say that are the people that support a faction of their nationalist.
Of course.
Like, a nationalist faction that was supported by the CIA.
Yeah.
And that they don't want to admit now was supported by the CIA.
Right.
I think we explained our views on the dissolution of Yugoslavia already.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Several times.
Yes,
Maybe we shouldn't go back there.
No.
Yes. All right. Well, cool. So the dark chapters of Arc 4 begin now.
Yes.
No more
Very
no
dark,
more
very grim.
Tamburitzins. No more sketch comedies.
We might have Tamburitzins.
Yeah?
Okay.
They will. I mean, I just said the Tamburitzins played Croatian songs for the Chetniks and upset them. The Tamburitzins don't go away. They might
Okay.
remain the only constant. through
Okay.
this.
All right, there you go, listeners. Something to hold on to as we enter this storm.
Indeed.
Okay. Cool.
All right, guys. Later.
See you soon.
Bye.
Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.